We'll open the discussion. So welcome to the noon discussion of Night's Watch. The focus of our clinical attention today will be on Friday the 13th. So where would the group like to start?
Maybe with Ralph.
Ralph. Observations?
It was viewed as like having like crazy speech, but he also had like kind of an interesting, eccentric kind of presentation of like even with the warnings, he said it in like this like weird way.
Thoughts? Hey, who are my horror movie fans out here? One.
Only me, really?
This trope is known as the harbinger. So within, again, we want to think of behavior as potentially being sanctioned by a culture or subculture. That comes up in exams all the time, and it comes up in clinical practice all of the time. So when a person presents to you with X, Y, or Z, if that behavior, if those thoughts are consistent with the culture within which they were raised, there's likely little to nothing to do. So on exams, this is choice D: do nothing, closely observe, reassure. Right? If you are a horror buff, you understand this as the harbinger trope, and here there is nothing further to do. Without these pro-social warnings from characters like Ralph, we wouldn't have the idea of setting the expectations as to what we're about to see next, and meaning next over the next 90 minutes. However, in cases in which the identified behavior is in fact abnormal and therefore causing clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, we have more of the discussion. So when you just don't inform about that, we'll just wait on Zoom.
It says I need streaming software to stream, and I don't have that on this computer. So
just to get the password from Instagram, so you guys can do it over your iPhones next week.
okay.
So for purposes of this discussion and make this more clinically and educationally relevant, let's say, in fact, the behavior is in fact causing functional impairment for our patient, for this character. What's our differential? How about we do this? We put you through exactly what I put my residents through. And that is, if we were to have 99 undergraduates here right now, we'd put them in the hallway somehow. And we polled them. What's going on here? Choice A is mood anxiety cluster, or choice B, psychotic dissociative cluster. Given what you just told us, given what everybody saw, having watched the movie, what would the majority of those 99 students vote? The votes are in. Any guesses as to how they would vote, A or B?
For Ralph.
Yeah.
They would probably vote B.
B, right? I agree.
Yeah.
All right. So, and the good news here is that, this first step in the process of case formulation is I actually often title it "Make a Commitment." The good news here is that if you commit to the wrong path, no big deal. It self-corrects, right? So, and I'll show you how later. That said, step two. Once you make a commitment, we have to arbitrarily choose one illness from which to work, right? So which one illness will the group consensus decide we should choose to kind of further our discussion or continue our discussion? One illness from within the psychotic / dissociative cluster or dissociative disorder chapters of the DSM. This is completely arbitrary. Any thoughts? Agreed. Step three, demonstrate your knowledge of the DSM. Tell me the 5 inclusion criteria defining the condition called schizophrenia. And again, the choice of schizophrenia as a starting point is completely arbitrary. But as part of that academic exercise, step 3 is now demonstrate your knowledge of the DSM. There are 5 inclusion criteria for which you need 2 to rule in. What are the 5 criteria defining schizophrenia? 1, hallucinations.
Delusion.
2, delusions. Negative symptoms. 3, that is the absence of different things that at baseline should be there, right? That's negative symptomology. 3.
Disorganized speech.
4, disorganized speech.
Did we say positive symptomology yet?
They're all positive.
They're all positive.
Anything that's not negative is positive. I learned that in medical school.
Disorganized behavior.
Grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. Boom, there's 5, right? You only need two to rule in. At this point, just to check, is Ralph ruling in? Let's take him out of the plot. I don't want you guys to be biased. And as much as a fan of horror I am, let's pretend that Ralph is sitting with us and he's communicating to us in real time everything that is part of the plot. All right, so now, does this real person named Ralph rule in at this point? Is he demonstrating two of the five things you just listed? Does he have a fixed belief that is not based in reality, aka a delusion?
I mean, not necessarily.
Well, again, I'm a horror fan, and later on this week I will be up at Camp Blood. All that respectfully, he's delusional, right? I'm not so sure this camp is cursed. Right? In real life, this is the way we have to treat people, right? And you mentioned that he had some quote unquote crazy speech. Is that consistent with grossly disorganized speech or thought process? Yeah. So the answer is yes. By the way, when in doubt, it's okay to take academic liberty and say yes, just for purposes of going through what we're trying to get through, which is the case formulation. So again, as a horror fan, I like to argue both of these points, but I'm not going to. All right. Next step, which is step number 4, is to appreciate that the condition that we chose, schizophrenia, is actually a diagnosis of exclusion. Right. So now you're going to have to tell me the 5 conditions that we have to examine and rule out in order to continue to rule in schizophrenia. 1, substance use, more specifically, a substance-induced psychotic disorder. 1. Schizoaffective disorder. 2.
And we do this a couple features.
Primary mood disorder. 3. Psychosis due to a general medical condition or another medical condition is number 4. Missing one more. Autism spectrum disorder. Good. Good. All right. So Friday the 13th is a fictional case of autism spectrum disorder. A, true, B, false, C, doesn't matter. You guys know it's a trick question. Everybody's thinking it's got to be C for some reason.
Doesn't matter.
Why does it matter? The reason why the American Psychiatric Association requires clinicians to investigate whether or not ASD is a precondition has everything to do with the overlapping signs. So if somebody is diagnosed with autism, age 7, age 8, because of very difficulty communicating verbally, behavior like headbanging. At 18, if they walked into an office in a vacuum, that looks like schizophrenia, right? Disorganized speech, disorganized behavior. And you're not going to change the diagnosis. Happy birthday, it's your 18th birthday, now you're schizophrenic. That's not the way this works. However, if we understand that this might actually be a case of new onset schizophrenia, what role a pre-existing condition like autism may play, or an ASD may play, if there are new onset symptoms that would not be explained by the pre-existing condition of autism spectrum, we can make the diagnosis, so it doesn't matter, because you told me that while quote unquote crazy speech does in fact look like there's an overlap, delusions are not. Right? The pre-existing condition of ASD would not explain the new onset delusions in Frank. I'm sorry, Ralph. So it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Right? The point prevalence of schizophrenia in the US population is about 1%. The point prevalence of schizophrenia in people who have ASD is about 1%. So it could happen. Right? So it really doesn't matter if Ralph has a pre-existing condition of ASD. That's why it's choice C. All right, let's go through these one by one. A substance-induced psychotic disorder. The first step in discussing this potential with a patient is first establishing that there is a substance-related disorder involved. What role do substances play in the plot of of Ralph's history of Friday the 13th. So number one, is there any discrete evidence in this movie, if you nerded out and you got to the script and you search terms like alcohol and stimulants and benzodiazepines, etc., would anything come up? Well, I know you guys did this.
No.
Right? So the answer is no.
No.
The answer is no. And this is a wonderful parallel to real life. When you ask a patient, can you tell me about your use of stimulants? Can you tell me about your use of cannabis, etc.? No, 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 no. At this point, should you maintain a high clinical index of suspicion nonetheless? Always.
Absolutely.
Right. So even if you search those terms in that doc, the script of Friday the 13th, and it was no across the board, we're going to continue to keep this in the differential anyway. And we can even pivot the discussion. Is there any symbolic evidence? So this is where you gotta get creative and think, is there symbolism of alcohol or any substance use in this movie? Sometimes, believe it or not, writers, directors, authors are creative. And they don't spoon feed you things, and you really experience some things that are not discreetly, in this case, in the film. So probably not, right? I didn't pick up on anything, but again, there might be more creative minds out there. No, we're good. All right. So why don't we do this? Despite no and no, let's consider that there might still be something that plays a role here, just for academic purposes. Because the next step would be whether or not the substance that you identified discreetly and or symbolically could physiologically induce psychosis. Right? Not every substance can induce every mental disorder. And if we're thinking that Ralph has a psychotic disorder, rule out substance-induced psychotic disorder, you're going to have to tell me the substances that could even physiologically induce psychosis. So there are 5, 5.5. What are they?
Marijuana.
1,
Meth,
2. So we'll say meth and any other stimulant,
cocaine,
same as meth.
Yeah.
2,
What category is OSD?
hallucinogens. Hallucinogen 3. I tried to skip that by, see if it'll change right now. 2 more. 2.5 more. That's the one people usually forget.
what did you say? Oh, and
1 more. More obvious one. Zen. Yeah. And the reason why it's 5.5 is that anything alcohol can induce, benzos can induce too. Right? So there's really a 1-to-1. There's one exception to that rule, and that's the anxiety disorders. Alcohol can induce anxiety disorders, while benzodiazepines and other sedatives can't. Right? It's the one exception, but otherwise, what goes for one goes for the other. So we'll say alcohol. All right. The great news here is, if you enjoy horror, is that there is a wonderful supernatural horror film called Paranormal Activity, whose main character may be struggling with psychosis. There is a secondary antagonist in this movie who happens to be her boyfriend, if not fiance, who frustrates a lot of us because he just sticks a camcorder in her face, or right, the entire movie, despite the fact that there's a lot of bad shit going down. We're not live streaming, right?
I mean,
His name
Harris.
happens to be Micah, M-I-C-A-H, which happens then to default to an acronym. M-I-C-A-H. So methamphetamine and other stimulants. I, inhalants. C, cannabis. A, alcohol. H, hallucinogens. So watch Paranormal Activity. You'll not only thank me, but you'll never forget the 5 classes of substances that can induce psychosis. All right. Back to Friday the 13th. Okay. Anything else about Ralph? Last step in verifying schizophrenia, since he's seeming to rule in at this point. And that is, Is there any evidence that has been presented to us that we have not yet accounted for that would perhaps go against this provisional diagnosis? Meaning that if you really did nerd out and took notes during this movie, and if you now had a thought exercise of crossing off everything that would have been explained by every illness that we've discussed over the past 10 minutes, would there be anything left on your notes? Because if the answer is yes, obviously we have to explain how and what role that might play. For instance, if during a scene he had over a panic attack, well, panic probably would not be explained by the diagnosis of schizophrenia, so we have to broaden our differential. Anything like that here? Agree. So it looks like we have a character, a fictional character that demonstrates aspects of schizophrenia. Which makes sense because what is the downward drift? It's a hypothesis floated in the 1960s, and for anybody who says anything, no, I wasn't born yet. So 1965, downward drift hypothesis. So the original thought was that poverty caused schizophrenia. And the discovery, a little bit beyond 1960, was that the exact opposite is true. That schizophrenia usually caused poverty. So individuals who were stricken with this mental disorder often lost their job, lost their homes, became homeless, and there was a downward drift of homelessness. So the downward drift hypothesis actually debunked the idea that poverty causes schizophrenia, which was the initial assumption or theory floated in the mid-1960s. Ralph is likely homeless. He's a trope. He's a harbinger, and his homelessness is likely indicative, if not supportive, of a mental disorder called schizophrenia. And it also incorporates the downward drift theory. Final conclusions on Ralph. Observations, something that you think we missed. Any questions about anything we covered? Other characters, Friday the 13th, who do you got? By the way, as you're thinking, I do want to look at two other illnesses that you did talk about in the context of Ralph, and that was a primary mood disorder, such as depression, and schizoaffective disorder. How do you differentiate somebody who presents with major depressive disorder with psychotic features versus somebody who has schizoaffective disorder?
For schizoaffective, doesn't like the mood typically change, and then after the mood kind of stabilizes, that's when they have the psychotic features versus major depression with like it's at the same time? Or am I getting the timeline wrong?
I think it's just reversed.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think the first step, it's a very convoluted discussion. It does serve to confuse generations of learners, trainees, and doctors. Trust me. The first thing to identify is that you're talking about one condition, schizoaffective disorder, that is published in the schizophrenia disorder chapter, the schizophrenia spectrum, and other psychotic disorder chapter of the DSM. The other condition called major depression or major depressive disorder is published in a totally separate chapter called the depressive disorders. So that's first and foremost. And even though that's obvious and intuitive, it's a great idea to start there. Because once you understand that, you then can verify that one condition, schizophrenia, is a primary psychotic process. And the other, major depressive disorder, is a primary affective process, mood process, specifically depressive process. And that'll owe right into the respective definitions. Schizoaffective disorder is demonstrated or characterized by the comorbid presentation of both schizo and affective symptoms, right? So hence schizoaffective disorder. That is, a person sitting in front of you will be both depressed and psychotic simultaneously. And that not only means perhaps as they're sitting in front of you, but during the episode, whether it's a week, a month, a year, it doesn't matter. Co-occurring schizo, psychotic, and affective depressive symptoms. Schizoaffective, that's why we named it that. Unfortunately, the person who has major depression with psychotic features will present to you in a slice of time looking exactly the same. They too will have co-occurring, simultaneous schizo and affective symptoms. You only can actually differentiate one from the other by their history. That is, remember how we started this conversation. For the person who has schizoaffective, the schizo symptoms will have come first, and the depressive symptoms will follow. And the exact opposite is true for the primary mood disorder, where the depressive symptoms are at the onset, and the psychotic symptoms will follow. Now, that's the textbook. In real life, medical literature, let's put a pause on that. While that continues to be true for the primary mood disorder, major depression with psychotic features, the real presentation for schizoaffective is more clouded. And that is, it's very difficult to tease out a history that the person was initially psychotic and then somewhere along the line became depressed. But what the APA does maintain is that there's at least a window of time during which there are primary psychotic symptoms in the absence of the depressive symptoms, therefore clarifying and confirming you're dealing with a primary psychotic process, schizoaffective disorder. The schizo comes before the affective. That makes sense? Okay. And then the only thing, only because on tests it probably is worthwhile, the question is, well, how long? For instance, if somebody's sitting in front of you and they're demonstrating both psychotic and mood symptoms, and you're thinking, all right, it's one or the other, and you ask, well, have you ever heard voices but not be depressed? And if they say, yeah, this morning, it probably doesn't cut it. So the question is, what happens if they say, well, the past day? Still doesn't cut it. 2 weeks is a magic window. And that's consistent with the medical literature. 2 weeks. There's a 2-week window where the individual does demonstrate psychosis in the absence of any affective symptoms like depressive symptoms. All right, so I just want to clarify that for, because it comes up all the time on tests. Another character, Friday the 13th. Every other character in this movie had perfectly normal and adaptive behavior.
Yeah.
Mrs. Voorhees.
Mrs. Voorhees,
We could-
she may have had some issues.
Pamela had some issues.
Yeah, she did. Pam Voorhees. So, what do we think's going on with Mrs. Voorhees?
She's hearing her son talking to her, telling her to kill people. She's having full like conversation, like, kill her, mommy, okay, like, oh, don't let her get away. Like,
So it was almost like representing the identity of her son through her own
Mhm.
voice, talking as her son, and then talking to the self that is her son, talking to her.
Great. And because of that, I think we would go down almost the exact same path as we just went through with regard to our case formulation. This is probably choice B, a psychotic dissociative spectrum. We're going to start with schizophrenia. She does seem to rule in with regard to the inclusion criteria, so we're really down that same path. However, I think when we get to step 4, which is appreciating that the condition is actually a diagnosis of exclusion, there's probably something here that we can refocus on, and it's a great example of how we're about to self-correct. That even though we chose path B, we're probably going to flip over to path A and have this correct. So what am I talking about here? Which one of the 5 exclusionary criteria do we think might actually be in play? Is she taking drugs? Is there a medical condition? Is she autistic? No. Is there any evidence of mood symptoms, dysphoria, sadness, depression? Heck yeah.
Yeah,
She's a mother who lost her
absolutely.
son. Yeah. Now, we don't see the interim. We don't see what happened between Jason's death and 1980. But I think it's very reasonable to assume that, number one, any clinician would inquire what happened, and that upon that type of questioning during a psychiatric evaluation, we would learn that she was quite depressed. right? So if we were to actually then write this script, immediately following Jason's death, she is likely, that is, Pamela is likely to be struggling with a condition called bereavement. Right? So what is bereavement?
Like prolonged grief, or not necessarily prolonged, but up to 12 months of grief, and like you're in sadness, and you're allowed to like have some thoughts of death as long as it's like only involving like joining the one that passed, but anything more than that is like major depressive if it's more than that.
True. It's normal grieving. If you want to get into the weeds and press your friends, grief is the emotion, bereavement is the syndrome, but otherwise those two terms are usually interchangeable. It's normal grieving, right? However, if we took a snapshot of Pamela in 1980, there's probably evidence to suggest that she did not go through the normal grieving process. She did not process bereavement. That could come along 5 stages, which are what? Denial, anger. She might still be there.
Sadness / depression.
Depression,
Bargain,
bargaining,
guilt.
Acceptance.
acceptance. Yeah, which she has not achieved.
No. I don't think
No.
she had a
No.
chance to.
If an individual gets stagnated, fixated at one of these steps, certainly it heightens risk that the bereavement process will not be reached satisfactorily.
I think an important point to note about whether or not she would have been able to move on, even if she survived, is the cold open of the movie, if I remember correctly, takes place in 1953.
Mhm.
And considering that she was potentially murdering people as early as 1953 following the accident to ensure nobody came to that camp, and
Camp
also
Squad.
as her own form of revenge. That was in 1953, and this movie takes place, or it was 1980, but it would take place in 1979.
Mhm.
So that is a 26-year period of her harboring enough violence and need for revenge for the loss of her son that she is willing to murder people just for coming to the camp to keep the camp closed, which
Mhm.
means I think she was going to be stuck in the depression anger spiral for indefinitely.
I don't disagree. And what would be the next step in that spiral? So you see Pamela, and your clinical suspicion is that she is not processing the death of her son in an adaptive way, to say it lightly. What made bereavement evolve to? What's the next step? Which is also not contained in this movie, but in the prequel that we are now writing. It's called Persisting Complex Bereavement Disorder. And I think of major note is that the word disorder is here. It's actually in the title, meaning that unlike bereavement, it is not normal. And therefore, it impairs functioning. It's creating clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning. Persisting complex bereavement disorder. Now, unlike bereavement, persisting complex bereavement disorder, often called complicated grief or complicated bereavement, does pose independent risk for a future mood disorder like major depression. And I think it's very reasonable to assume that our antagonist did eventually reach clinical criteria for major depressive disorder. And at some point, her major depression did begin to incorporate psychotic features, including hearing the voice of her son and then communicating with her son. So I think Pamela's evolution is ultimately going to reach a single best diagnosis of major depression with psychotic features. And that's only embracing the role, and that's either predisposing or precipitating role of the death of Jason Voorhees. Other thoughts about Pamela?
I think another facet of her character that I considered was kind of when she went on her whole rant about why she was killing people with regard to because I think as part of her bereavement is like assigning blame. And one of the blames that she assigned to is the people who were supposed to be watching over the camp at the time, because she said that they were, doing whatever at the time while her son was drowning. So I think it speaks to a facet of how she dealt with that period of bereavement, that she saw people coming to that camp as almost echoes of the people who did not save her son. And this was sort of by killing them, she was in a sense killing the concept of the people whose neglect ultimately resulted in her son drowning.
And let's say she presented to you for your psychotherapy appointment. What's a couple of things? There's two things I think, given what you had just said, that would become the focus of your attention during psychotherapy. Now, one of them, a little bit of a hint, you've got to know a little bit of the backstory, which I assume everybody's deep dived. How did Jason die?
Drowned.
Hmm?
He drowned.
He drowned. How did he do? Why did he drown?
Couldn't swim.
Why?
Got bullied, right?
I don't know if he was
Sorry,
bullied.
No.
Why would a boy who couldn't swim be at a camp around a lake?
Because he wasn't being like watched properly, or she.
Why was he even at the camp? He wasn't. He wasn't at the camp. Pamela Voorhees could not find a babysitter for her son, and she had to work because she's a single parent. So she takes him to work and instilled the responsibility to camp counselors, who accepted the responsibility, but the guilt is hers. That's why displaced guilt is that her id is not able to process those components that took place that resulted in that boy being at that camp that day in the first place. Something she can't get through. She blames herself, and only through displacement and projection can she displace that blame onto others. That's what's going on here. That's what you're going to have to deal with in psychotherapy. The other maladaptive defense mechanism beyond projection is called undoing. Undoing. And that is the role that the subsequent murders play in her somehow undoing the wrong that she feels was inflicted upon her and her family by those original camp counselors. Undoing. Now, it's not justify murder, but it's to understand it. And it's something else you have to process. Because my guess is that she is going to present for, well, she had survived psychotherapy, because I think a psychiatrist is going to be able to maintain that she was not of sound mind when she committed those murders. She was depressed. She was attending to internal stimuli. She was psychotic and therefore not of sound mind. And I think that's another discussion, maybe a forensic discussion on Pamela Voorhees on trial. But there's a chance that she is going to see you in your outpatient practice. Further thoughts, Pamela Voorhees?
What about like a dissociative?
Yeah, so about 70 to 80% of people with schizophrenia will have dissociative symptoms, and about 70 to 80% of people with a primary dissociative disorder will have psychotic symptoms. What the literature is a little bit more unclear is what happens if those psychotic symptoms are actually in the context of a primary mood disorder. It's probably not going to be nearly as robust as 80%, but it can happen. So it doesn't surprise me at all that she's beginning to lose her sense of self and station.
I guess that's what the differentiation comes in between someone hearing voices and someone making the voice themselves in that regard. So someone with schizophrenia can exhibit those symptoms as well.
Yeah, I mean, all dissociation is, when you think of the neurobiology of it, is the corpus callosum just losing its function. And right hemisphere and left hemisphere begin to miscommunicate. That's the general idea behind dissociation. And is it really that much of a reach that in people afflicted with a primary psychotic disorder, even a primary mood disorder with psychosis, that the corpus callosum would lose some function? Of course, that's why we see the incidence of dissociative symptoms in psychotic states the way we do. Again, higher for primary psychotic disorders than other, but that's of no surprise. All right, closing thoughts, final thoughts, other observations? For those of you who've been part of this lecture before, you fortunately have a gag order. Not pointing any fingers. However, everything we just discussed in terms of trying to make sense of the multiple characters in Friday the 13th is incorrect. We missed a major diagnosis of what Friday the 13th is really about. And because this week has a Friday the 13th, I will only provide the real answer this Friday up in Blairstown where the movie was filmed. So meet me up there, text me. I'll be happy to meet you in front of the Roy Theater, which is what we always do. And I'll give you the real diagnosis of what's going on in this film. All right, so share that on Discord, and hopefully everybody heard that. And hopefully we'll see you Friday.